one of my most important morning rituals is I spend 10 to 15 minutes every day brainstorming ideas. So I will just get out my tablet with a stylus and I'll come up with ideas for articles, for books, but often just random ideas that have nothing to do with that might be, say, like I'll think of a snowman and then I'll think of, instead of a pipe, let's give him a vape pen. And none of these ideas, that's not true. 95% of these ideas are never going to see the light of day. They are mediocre to terrible, somewhere in there. But there is 5% that I think are good, good enough to develop, and those have turned into books, articles, businesses. And the reason I do it, even though so many are unusable, is because you just, like you just said, creativity is a muscle, and I like to work out every day.
Okay, AJ, welcome to the show.
Oh, delighted to be back. Thank you, thank thou, or thank ye, whichever it is.
Okay, so today we're going to be focusing on your book, A Year of Living Constitutionally. One man's humble quest to. Can you remind us the subtitle again?
Good question. Let's see if I can remember. One man's humble quest to follow the Constitution as follow the Constitution's original meaning. That's
Right,
it.
right.
Nailed it.
Before we get into that, I want to ask you a few questions about just more general things. So the first thing I wanted to ask you about is, to what extent do you think that creativity is a muscle?
Hugely. I am definitely on that train. The more, in fact, I just wrote for my Substack an essay about one of my most important morning rituals is I spend 10 to 15 minutes every day brainstorming ideas. So I will just get out my tablet with a stylus and I'll come up with ideas for articles, for books, but often just random ideas that have nothing to do with, that might be, say, like I'll think of a snowman and then I'll think of, instead of a pipe, let's give him a vape pen. And none of these ideas, that's not true. 95% of these ideas are never going to see the light of day. They are um, mediocre to terrible, somewhere in there. But there is 5% that I think are good, good enough to develop, and those have turned into books, articles, businesses. And the reason I do it, even though so many are unusable, is because you just, like you just said, creativity is a muscle, and I like to work out every day.
That's brilliant. And how do you discern between good ideas, like the ones worth keeping and the ones worth letting go?
That's a great question. I have a couple of heuristics that I use. One is, if I think something does have potential, I'll tell uh, a bunch of people, 10 people, what do you think of this? And a lot of times they won't tell the truth because they're friends, but you can kind of sense, if you do it enough, you can see their eyes light up, or they can. So that is helpful to me. I think it's also helpful if I come back to the idea like weeks and months later, it keeps recurring in my mind. Then I'm like, oh, that is interesting. Um, Maybe there is something to it. And a couple of other heuristics, but yeah, that is a big part of it. What are the good ones?
For sure. And well, the thing, okay, there's a few schools of thought uh, on ideas. Some people say that you should keep them to yourself until you've actually taken action on them and you've sort of, brought them into the world. And other people say you should tell others about your ideas. Like, are you very much of the opinion that you should just share them widely and get the feedback that way, as opposed to, keeping them to yourself until you've actually done something about them?
I have radically changed my mind on this. At the start of my career, which is a long time ago, like 20, more than 20 years, 30, something like that. Long time. I was very secretive. I was like the CIA. In fact, this is how bizarre and paranoid I got. I was writing a book in my early 20s about the eerie similarities between Elvis Presley and Jesus. And it was based on the fact that Elvis had once said he thought he was the second coming. And I thought, well, let me just investigate this, even though, it was a joke book. But I was so paranoid that someone else would come up with this idea. This was so long ago, people took books out of the library. I went to the library and took out books about Elvis. Then I went to a different library and took out books about Jesus. So that's the level of insanity that I was experiencing about this paranoia. I have gone almost 180 degrees. I mean, not always. Sometimes I do, hold back, but most of the time, I find the benefits of telling people your idea outweigh the dangers of it getting stolen. And the benefits include, oh, you're writing about the Constitution. My best friend is a Harvard professor. Let me hook you up. Or having them suggest ideas. Oh, you're writing a book about the Constitution. Well, have you thought of quartering a soldier like in the Third Amendment? And to me, that so far outweighs. And I have seen that happen. Like a friend of mine is a writer, and this was many years, probably 15 years ago. He put on Facebook a joke post saying, "I am so tired. I'm gonna write a book called for my kids called Go the F to Sleep." It wasn't F, he spelled it out, and he was just joking, but everyone chimed in. It's like, that's actually a funny idea. Maybe you should develop that. So even just putting out like a little idea and seeing how it resonates, that can inspire it to become a bigger idea.
Hmm. I like it. I like it. Something that I find sort of an interesting idea to entertain is, are you familiar with Elizabeth Gilbert? She's also a writer.
Of course,
She's
super
got that,
talented.
she's got that book, was it Big Magic or something? And her whole thesis is that ideas sort of have a world of their own, and then they will find a human like an AJ Jacobs who they think can bring something into the world, and they'll sort of possess that human until they do something about it, and then say you don't action it, then they'll go into somebody else and do the same. It's a very out there theory, but it's fun to think about.
Yeah, it's a great story. It's a little woo-woo for my thinking. And I also think some people get their ideas, the muse comes to them while they're walking or taking a shower or just unexpectedly. Sometimes that happens to me, but more often it's when I make an appointment with the muse and I have this sort of very structured creativity, which sounds a little paradoxical to have regimented creativity, but I find it works for me, and that's where I get most of my ideas. And if I wait for the muse to enter my body, then I'm going to be waiting a long time because often my mind is thinking of petty, boring stuff. And I fight against it. I'm in cognitive behavioral therapy to try to uh, have more metacognition about what I'm thinking about. But one way to fight it is to have this 15 minutes where I just devote it to creativity.
There's a quote from the book The War of Art, which I'm sure you've probably read, by Somerset Maugham, and it's like, I only write when inspiration strikes. Luckily, she strikes every morning at 9 a.m. sharp. And this is sort of what we're talking
Exactly.
about.
Totally agree. Yeah. And having these very regimented rules about creativity, as I say, it may seem paradoxical, but I really think it helps. Even having a word count today, I have to do 1,000 words. I have to write 1,000 words, even if I know some of them are crap. Or when I have writer's block, just saying, I'm going to start writing, uh, and being aware that the first 15 minutes of what I write is going to be total crap. But I am just going to get in the feeling of writing so I can get some motivation and get the sort of the inertia going. So, just typing, it could be like hey, there's a pigeon on my windowsill and it's pecking what looks like a little rock. I hope it doesn't choke on the rock. Ridiculous, crazy stuff. But just having the feeling of moving my fingers will get me in the mood for writing.
For sure, for sure. And I think the sort of end goal here is with the ideas as well. It's like I know you're quite friendly with James Altucher, and his whole thing
Yeah,
is like becoming an idea machine. So you do this enough, and then the ideas just they happen as a byproduct. You know, you're just in that way of thinking all the time. You're probably doing a lot more lateral thinking, and you're just training your brain in a different way. And I suppose all the puzzles you do as well probably help with this too. You know, so
absolutely. Yeah. And I agree 100% with James and his theory. And yes, puzzles I think are a good way to train your brain to think because puzzles are never your first thought is almost always wrong. The whole point of a puzzle is to misdirect you. So it's teaching you how to look at a problem from many different angles, which is a huge part of creativity.
for sure. So I think you probably would disagree because you see it from the inside, but from the outside, I think you've probably one of the best jobs in the world. So you would maybe describe, I don't know what you would describe your job as, but maybe as a method writer, you know, not a method actor, but a method writer. And
I like that. Yes, I love that phrase.
I'd love to know how you got to be doing what you're currently doing. Maybe if you could just tell people what you do and the books that you write as well, like the Year of Living Biblically, for example, or the one about the health or whatever. If you want to just share a little about
Sure.
that.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I agree. I am so grateful that I have this job. I mean, as you say, it has many annoyances like every other job, but overall, I'm super grateful. And the job I have is I'm a nonfiction writer, so for magazines, newspapers, but mostly books. And I also have a podcast. And my MO is that I will take on an experiment, a lifestyle experiment, and try to see what I can learn from it. So there are a few that you mentioned. One was the Year of Living Biblically, where I tried to follow all the rules in the Bible, so the Ten Commandments, but also growing a huge beard. And I did that because I knew nothing about religion. I grew up in a very secular home. I did one about gratitude, where I went around the world and thanked 1,000 people who had anything to do with my morning cup of coffee. So I went broad. I went thanked the barista in New York, but also I went to South America and thanked the farmer and the truck driver who drove the coffee beans, the people who made the road so the truck driver could drive them. So I took it really far. Just a couple others. I did one where I tried to be the healthiest person alive. So I revamped everything, my diet, exercise, sleep, stress, how I went to the bathroom, most healthy way to go to the bathroom. So I love learning these. And then I write these books where I report on the good and the bad and what works for me and what doesn't, and all of the pain and misery I go through, but also the joy and wisdom that I get.
And the pain and misery that you put your wife through as well, and all of these.
Good point.
Um, so, but how did you land here? Did you start as a journalist and then gradually make your way into writing books, or how did you get to be doing this kind of work?
That's exactly it. I started as a more traditional journalist. I started at a small newspaper in California. Then I moved to magazines in New York City, like Entertainment Weekly magazine and Esquire magazine. And I, I just a couple, 5% of my assignments were in this genre. I would come up with an idea. So, for instance, one of my early ones was this was very early, so like 25 years ago. I happened to look very similar physically to uh, an actor who was in a Oscar-nominated movie. His name was Noah Taylor. The movie was called Shine. It was about a pianist. And I looked so much like him that the Entertainment Weekly magazine sent me to the Oscars masquerading as this guy because we found out he wasn't going. So I was sort of going in his place. And the idea was, what's it like to be a movie star for a night? And it was wild. I mean, the amount of positive feedback I got, I never even said that I was this guy. People just assumed I was because I looked so much like him. And so it was really a fascinating look into how it can warp your ego because I got all arrogant, even though these people were not even complimenting me. They were complimenting someone else, but it was so overwhelming, the feedback. And I was like, this is a fun experiment. most of my experiments since then, I do not masquerade. I'm very open and honest about what I'm doing. But that sort of gave me the idea. And then my first book in this genre was about reading the Encyclopedia Britannica from A to Z when that still existed. And that was inspired by my dad, who he started to read the encyclopedia when I was a kid, but he didn't finish. He made it to the middle of the letter B, like, I don't know, Bolivia, boomerang, and then realized he had a life. So I kind of finished what he began and wrote about that experience.
Fantastic. Well, um, I would say that if you this is an idea from we're speaking about ideas earlier, an idea from me to you. If you were to teach a master class, you know the master classes
Sure,
platform where
sure.
if you were to teach a master class on a guide to method writing or the
Mm.
method writing method, I would definitely pay good money to attend that. Or if you wrote a book on it, I know you're in between books, that would be something I would definitely
Well,
be
that's a
interested in.
lovely idea. Thank you for
I
that.
know a lot of people would too.
I am
So
grateful. If anyone from Masterclass is listening, please contact me.
so you're the original. I've heard Tim Ferriss call himself the human guinea pig, but you're the original human guinea pig, I would say, because you've been doing this for a long time.
Well, it is funny. I love Tim, and I've known him many, many years. And actually, I have been doing it longer than him because when he was writing his book, The 4 Hour Work Week, his first book, he called me out of the blue. I didn't know who he was. He said, I'm a first-time writer. I loved your article in Esquire called My Outsourced Life. And this was an article I wrote where I hired a team of people in India to do everything for me. So they answered my emails, they answered my phone, they argued with my wife for me, and it was a wild experience. And he said, I'm doing something on outsourcing. Can I reprint your article from Esquire? And I figured he's a first time author. He's going to sell 14 copies. I'm sure. Let him reprint it. He doesn't have to pay me. And then a year later, he calls and says, just want to let you know my book's coming out tomorrow and it's #1 on Amazon. I'm like, #1 in 20 something careers? No, #1. And I was like, oh, how did you do that? Because he is a genius at marketing. So, but of course, I'm very glad that I didn't make it difficult for him and gave it to him because in the end, it did pay off. It was karma. A lot of his readers have known me through that and have reached out to me and bought my stuff.
Brilliant, brilliant. So with your new book, A Year of Living Constitutionally, we're going to get into the content first, but you mentioned marketing there, about Tim being a good marketer. I've heard you say before that you think of marketing as part of the creative process. Like you don't see a separation between the product itself or the book itself and actually promoting it. So I was just wondering, did you come up with any interesting ideas for how to actually promote your latest book?
I did. And I didn't always feel this way. I felt that marketing was beneath me or just annoying or a different skill set. And I realized if I wanted to be a successful writer, I have to change my mind. So I reframed it as this creative exercise. And how can we? So I did many things. One strategy I like to do. The book was about the Constitution and American history. So how can I slice and dice that up to appeal to different audiences? So I wrote for business outlets, top 5 business tips from the founding fathers, or I'm trying to think of some of the other ones, or psychology, like top 5 uh, life hacks to be happier from the founding fathers. And or a lot of it was about law. An essay I wrote a op-ed for the LA Times about how the president is too powerful. Maybe we should go back to the original idea of 3 presidents, where you split up the power among 3 presidents.
Interesting. Okay. And this is such a niche book. What, why did you write this book and what gave you the idea?
Well, I read a couple of years ago a statistic that 60% of Americans have not read the Constitution. And I realized I am in that 60%. I never read it, even though it's only 4 pages. They're big pages, but 4 pages. So never read it. And yet, every day it's in the news, the top of the news. It has a huge impact on our lives. This 238-year-old document affects all sorts of things, health decisions, guns, religion, where we go to school, what we can say, what we can write. It has a massive impact. And I realized I I should read it. But not only that, since I'm a method learner, I should live it. Why not live it? So that was the premise of the book, where I tried to follow the original meaning of the Constitution to try to get inside the founders' minds and figure out the meaning of America and where America should go from here. So that meant trying to follow the Constitution using the technology and mindset of 1789, which meant getting a musket, an 18th century musket, and carrying it around the Upper West Side of New York. It meant, that's my Second Amendment, it meant writing with a quill pen, writing pamphlets with a quill instead of going on social media, because that was how the First Amendment was followed. It meant all sorts of things: quartering a soldier, finding a soldier to stay in my house, and or ask him to leave, since that's my Third Amendment right. So it was a wild and educational and weird. It was weird and absurd at times, but also enlightening and fascinating. And I learned a ton about the Constitution and what it really means. And so the book is sort of a crash course on that, mixed with adventures and history and memoir.
What was going through your mind when you were carrying a musket through New York City? What did that feel like? And yeah, what was that like?
Well, it was a little stressful. It was a little stressful because it could have gone sideways. I mean, I felt I got lucky because I didn't get arrested. I didn't. Now, some people were not appreciative of me carrying a musket, even though it's big. It's 11 pounds and it's over probably 5 feet tall. And it's, yeah, you really, I was impressed by how hard it must have been to be a soldier back then, how much you had to carry. But I will say it came in handy one time, which was that I walked into a coffee shop at the same time as another customer, and he said, "You go first. I'm not going to argue with a guy with a musket." So it was a little weird. Part of the idea was, though, I actually went and shot the musket. And that was very enlightening because it highlighted the difference between a, a modern gun and an 18th century musket. Uh, because the modern gun, you just pull the trigger and you're done. A musket, so many steps to fire. You have to pour in the gunpowder in 2 places, take out the ramrod, put back the ramrod, all sorts. It's like 15 steps, like building a desk from IKEA. So it was, and you couldn't do a mass shooting in the same way with a musket. So it was a way into one of the most important controversies, which is, does the Second Amendment cover muskets, as that was originally, which were the main weapons at the time it was written, or does it also cover AR-15s? And you've got the two sides. I'll briefly, because in the book I try to present both sides. I steel man, which is the opposite of straw man. I try to steel man both sides. And I do come out on the side more of living constitutionalism, which we can talk about, but I'd want to present both sides. So in the gun debate, the sides would be, one, this is such a different machine that the Second Amendment was not meant to cover it. It's as if you wrote a law in 1780 that on this little tiny country lane, wheeled vehicles are perfectly fine and legal. At the time, wheeled vehicles were wheelbarrows. Now we have 16, 18 wheel trucks. So are those really something that should be allowed on this little tiny country lane with kids? Maybe not. On the other side, you've got the pro gun, the gun rights folks who would say, no, it applies. It's about the right to carry a gun, no matter what that gun is. Because think of the First Amendment. The First Amendment was written when it applied to pamphlets, but now it applies to the internet. You can't say the First Amendment only applies to stuff printed on a wooden press like Ben Franklin did. It applies to all technology. So those are the two sides, and this was a way to engage in that debate.
And walking around New York City with a musket, right? That does take a bit of guts. That's quite you might call it a social risk. So something I was curious to ask you is like, how do you think about social risks like that? Like, have you always had the freedom to do those things and not worry too much what other people will think of you? Or are you still anxious about that? Or is this something that just comes naturally quite easy to you?
No, I definitely get anxious and nervous, and there's high levels of embarrassment, which I think is good because it makes more conflict for the book. But I have some strategies I use so that I can, make myself do this. One is I try to remind myself that hopefully it's for the greater good, because I do think that I do hope that the book will have a helpful message, and I sort of see myself as sacrificing a little bit of my dignity to get that message out there. Another is, like you had mentioned, method writing and method acting. I think of myself as an actor. I'm like, this is a character. I'm going to carry it around. I'm a musket guy and see what happens. Those are two of the main strategies I use.
Brilliant, brilliant. All right, so I want to get into some of the key, maybe psychological takeaways from the book, and
Yeah.
something I found really interesting was a link you found between writing with a quill and slow thinking. Can you maybe tell us about this?
Yes, I feel that I wrote some of the book, not all of it, with a quill pen, like an actual goose quill that I carved myself. And I feel that it changed the way I thought and wrote, because it did. I was cut off from the internet, so I didn't have the dings and chimes, baldness ads that usually come with being online. So I feel I was able to focus more, go a little deeper, see the nuances, and it just is like a waiting period for my thoughts. I couldn't just thumb text someone some angry emojis and acronyms. I had to actually, if I were writing a letter, I would have to write it, put it in an envelope, put the seal on. So it slowed things down. And I think that's a good thing, because I think we need fewer hot takes and more cold takes. I think we need to rise above those immediate emotional reactions, which can often be misleading, and take the bigger context and longer view. So I don't think everyone needs to go back to a quill, although they can if they want. But any way that you can force yourself to think and talk and act and write offline is good. So that could just be a regular pen or a pencil, could be using one of the software like Freedom just to kick you off the internet for a couple hours.
And did you find yourself you were still productive using a pen or a quill, or did it slow you down?
Well, it was interesting. It's in a sense, it slowed down my thinking, but in terms of productivity, it was as good or better than being on a laptop, because on a laptop, I'm always getting distracted. And, of course, there's the sort of the startup brain cost of switching tasks. So that I think is more likely to slow me down. Whereas with the quill, I am more focused and more productive in that way.
Interesting. So I'm writing my first book at the minute as well, and I was traveling recently. I didn't have access to a laptop, so the only way I could write it was just in an A4 notepad. So I just had to write it with a pen, and I found my thinking just flowed really well. Like it was actually a lot more enjoyable that way as well. So I think there's something to that. And have you continued this on since? Like, I'm not obviously not with a quill, but are you writing with a pen and paper at any stage of the day now, or is this have you left it behind?
Oh no, I love writing longhand. I try to write, I mean, I do all of my brainstorming in the morning longhand, and I try to write my outlines for articles or books longhand because that allows me to, that's the time you really need to give it some deep thought because you have to organize it. But I'm glad to hear that it also worked for you. And there is some scientific evidence that, there you can Google it. There's a bunch of studies about how when you're writing longhand, it allows you to remember stuff better because it's engaging the motor cortex. I don't know the scientific words, but that's there is some science. I wouldn't say it's, completely settled science, but it indicates that there are advantages to writing longhand.
Why do they call it longhand? I never understood that.
That's a good point. Yeah, well, sure. Yeah, yeah, writing by hand. Maybe longhand is just when you spell out all the words because shorthand is when you have little symbols for the words. So maybe I should say, yeah, writing by hand. So yeah, when I say longhand, substitute writing by hand.
Okay, okay. And okay, so what about epistemic humility and flexible thinking? This is important stuff.
To me, it's huge, and that is it's a big problem in the current day discourse. Is everyone is so certain, and I think certainty is a dangerous thing, and we've become so entrenched in our political positions, our tribes, and this uh, the founders at their best, and they had huge flaws, as I talk about in the book, but at their best, a lot of them had epistemic humility, meaning that they were willing to change their mind. They were willing to look at the evidence and be convinced by reason. And one of my favorite founders is Ben Franklin. I love him. And he he advised when you're in an argument, don't use words like certainly or undoubtedly. Instead, use words like it seems to me or I could be wrong, but and that to me does make much more productive conversations, even a little hack like that. He also, at the Constitutional Convention, told a wonderful little story, a little parable. He said there was this French lady, and she said to her sister, Sister, it's so strange. Why is it that I'm the only person I've ever met who is correct on every single issue? And of course, his point was we are all that French lady. We all think we are correct on every issue, and yet we all have our biases and cognitive distortions. So he was sort of doing like Daniel Kahneman like behavioral economics 230 years ago. And I totally admire him for that. So I do try to remember what are the chances that me, A.G. Jacobs, is the one person out of 8 billion who is correct on every single issue? Pretty low. That's a pretty low chance that that's true. So be like Ben Franklin and just have some epistemic humility. And as you say, I think it's incredibly important. Like, we're not going to find solutions if everyone is so arrogant about being right.
What did he say? It was something like maybe you said it there, but the older I get, the less certain I am of my own opinions.
Yeah, it was in that same speech at the Constitutional Convention, and I love that too.
Is there anything or any significant things you've changed your mind on over the years that you were like maybe certain on in the past, and then you've actually thought, actually, no, there's more nuance to that than I thought? If
Well,
nothing comes to
one
mind, don't worry.
one is we just mentioned. I used to be so paranoid about telling people my ideas, and now I've made a switch to telling people. So that's just one example of a practical thing. One example of a policy thing that I changed my mind about while researching this book is I always thought the United States system of states was very strange because why do we have two different governments. And I'm not alone. Alexander Hamilton in the Constitutional Convention said, we should probably get rid of states. People can't serve two masters. We shouldn't have two sets of laws. I mean, you want one set of laws. He later said he was kidding because he got a lot of flack for it. But his point, I think, is a decent one. So and states historically have been often the ones that are holding up civil rights legislation, like in the South, for Black people, for instance. But when I talked to all of these brilliant constitutional scholars, which is what I did, in addition to carrying a musket, I interviewed dozens of geniuses who think about this all the time, and they point out there are advantages to the states. For instance, it's called the laboratory of democracy. So you can have a state that tries out some new interesting policy. Maybe it's congestion pricing. Maybe it's healthcare. Obamacare originally started as a Massachusetts policy. Oddly, that Mitt Romney, who is a Republican, was behind. So anyway, and if it works on the state level, maybe take it to the national level. So at their best, states can be these sort of experimental laboratories. And I am all for experimentation, as you can imagine.
It's sort of like if you were a restaurant owner and you maybe employed 30 chefs, it's like sending each chef away to work on their own recipes. And then the ones that work really well, you take them back and you have them in the restaurant for everybody to use, sort of thing.
I love that. That's a great analogy.
So tell me about the importance of balancing rights with responsibilities.
Yes. Well, I think that back then, the worldview was very much about a balance of rights and responsibilities. And famously, there's the Bill of Rights, the right to free speech, the right to bear arms. I do think that the founders would have included a Bill of Responsibilities, but they just figured it was so taken for granted, like so woven into society. And that meant you were not, responsibility or virtue meant you were often sacrificing your own well-being a little bit for the greater good. So that it could mean being part of the bucket brigade. So when there's a fire, you are out there helping. Most adult men were in the militia, their state militia. So 4 times a year, they had to go and train in case someone invaded. And I feel, and there's evidence of this, it's not like I'm just making it up. We have gone much more towards the individual rights model, and see rights almost as a trump card. The individual trumps everything. So, my right to free speech, I can do whatever I want, it doesn't matter how it affects society, because it is my individual right to free speech. I think we've gone too far in that direction. I love individual rights, and I'm grateful that they've been developed, but I think we need to balance them and keep in mind the responsibilities and how it affects the greater good. And that is a more founding father, the 18th century point of view, sort of the balancing of rights with responsibilities and the greater good.
Yeah, to me that strikes me as like super important. Like almost that these are two sides of the same coin, and that like the price you pay for your rights is the responsibilities that you owe to your community and the society that you've grown up in. That's a very, very valid point.
I agree. I think you need both. I absolutely think you need both.
What else do you feel from the 17th century is worth uh, reviving in modern life? Like, what else can we learn from these people that we should bring back?
That is a good question. Well, one thing is they were very DIY, of course. They didn't have a choice. So when I made my quills, I would make my quills. I would order over the internet, which I know was not 18th century, but I would order these feathers, and then I would get out like a straight razor and shave them into a point. And there was something lovely about working with their hands. And there's literature and some great books about how we've become alienated from objects because we just buy them off Amazon and have no idea of their origin. Whereas if you do it DIY, there is something that connects you, makes you more grateful, and makes you, I guess, take care of them better instead of a throwaway culture. So I would say that would be nice. I am not very handy, so I'm not really practicing what I'm preaching very much, but I do still make my own quills. But I think that's a nice lesson from the 18th century.
I recently watched an amazing documentary. It's about the life of Brian Eno, who's like a music producer. He's responsible for like David Bowie, U2, I think Coldplay as well, the Talking Heads, like behind all these like amazing acts from the past few decades. And he was talking about how we now live in a really specialized world. And the human brain has actually shrunk in size quite significantly because whenever we were hunter gatherers, we had to be masters of a lot. So we had to do so many different things. And we were generalists mostly. But now, because like we live in a world where we use everything but know how nothing works, we're very, our brains have actually shrunk in size. So that surprised me when I discovered it. And like even me, for example, like see trying to put together, I've just moved into a new home. I'm trying to like build IKEA furniture and I'm like like I'm useless at it.
Absolutely.
Um
And I will say one of my books was about, I think I mentioned reading the encyclopedia. And one of the things I just a qualifier, I do not want to go back to the past. The past in many ways was horrible. It was racist, sexist, dangerous. Cutting edge medicine was things like tobacco smoke enema, where you would literally blow smoke up someone's ass to cure them of stomach ailments. But that said, there are elements like we've been discussing that were interesting in the past and are worth reviving. And I remember reading about people like Goethe, the German writer, but he was so much more than a writer. He was a scientist. He studied color theory and wrote about it. He was a lawyer. He was a stage manager. He designed stages. He designed irrigation systems. He designed uniforms. He was a true Renaissance man. And I do feel like Brian Eno says, we've lost a lot of that because of the specialization. And there are advantages to specialization, but the huge drawbacks. And I feel we can again come to some sort of medium, like with responsibilities and rights, have specialization, but also, even if you're super specialized in science, take courses in something totally different, watercolor painting, and see if you can make a connection that will help you in both.
Even if you look at someone like Franklin, he was a printer, he's a politician, you could argue a scientist, an inventor, like big
Oh yeah,
generalist. And that
absolutely. And a humorist. He wrote a famous book called Fart Proudly, or an essay, Fart Proudly, all about, and it's actually interesting because his argument was our farts smell unpleasant, but do we have the technology to change that? Like maybe we can develop some sort of elixir that will make our farts smell better. Nowadays, I feel, especially with gene splicing and CRISPR, you could make farts smell like lavender if you wanted. If you put a couple million into that, Eli Lilly, I think it could happen.
that would change the world, AJ. Let's get hopefully somebody that is listening to this goes after that. Um, what would you say were the major differences between politicians back then and politicians today?
Um, that's a good question. I mean, I'm tempted to say that they were more virtuous and thought of the greater good. And I think there is a sense of that. I mean, I think part of the problem uh, now is that you get a lot of people who are good people who go into politics, but the incentives are so out of whack because the incentive is, if you're a congressperson in America, to get elected in 2 years. So you're spending the majority of your time fundraising. And that was not something they had to do back then. They didn't, fundraising was not a huge part of their lives. And in fact, the truly virtuous politician was not supposed to run for office. He stood for office. So you just announced you're available, and then it would be beneath you to sort of campaign. So I think, I don't want to exaggerate, there was ambition and corruption back then, and there are good people now, but I think the finance part has made it so it is, the incentives are all out of whack.
It that makes a lot of sense. But there there's a big paradox in these people as well, because you know, by all accounts, they were really good people morally in a lot of domains, but they were also slave owners. How do we resolve that paradox? Can we? Is it just like, how did do you think they knew that this was wrong, but they were just like, this is the way things are and we're not going to change it? Like, what are your
Yeah,
thoughts on that?
it's such a good and important question because, yeah, as you say, these people were claiming to found the first free society, and some of them were owned human beings. It is just astounding, the hypocrisy. And not all, by the end of his life, my favorite Ben Franklin was a big abolitionist, and John Adams. But there were, Thomas Jefferson. And as to your question, some of them were very aware of the hypocrisy. And Thomas Jefferson was one of those. You can look at his writings. He talks about how slavery is an evil, and he talks about how he knows that he should give up his enslaved people, but that he doesn't use the word lazy and greedy, but that's essentially what he was saying. He was too accustomed to his lifestyle to do it, and he was too craven and hypocritical. So some of them knew. There were, I think, some who were less morally aware and thought slavery was a natural, so-called natural state of affairs, but a lot of them didn't, and they were just too. And I tend to judge them harshly, as they should be judged, but I also try to remember, in 200 years, some of what I do is going to be shocking. I don't even know what it is. Maybe it's taking an airplane. Like, I love to travel, even though I know that it's terrible for the environment, and that is a huge issue. So I think we can condemn them, but also don't get too arrogant ourselves that we are the paragons of morality.
I admire you turning that back on yourself and thinking, in what ways am I that hypocritical? And I was thinking about this as well. And I'm like, I think it might be, I think the modern equivalent of that. And people are going to be like, probably not going to like me saying this because I'm a total hypocrite in this area as well. But I think like things like factory farming and eating meat and stuff, like I think in a couple hundred years, people are going to look back in that and potentially look at the same way that we look at people that owned slaves back then. I don't
Yeah.
know,
Well,
potentially. And
you're certainly not the first to say that. And I think it's a very, very possible hypothesis. And I think that there are two ways to address a problem like that. One is to try to change our morality, but a possibly more effective way is to change the technology so that factory farming is no longer necessary. And that's why I am very pro cultured meat, because I think if it can be done inexpensively and safely, then that will be a huge moral leap forward, because it would mean we wouldn't have to keep billions of animals in these horrible conditions.
for sure, that's a really good point. Have you tried culture meat before?
No, I mean, I've tried things like the Impossible Burger. I'm ready to try it. I am absolutely ready. In fact, I am a vegetarian for moral reasons, but uh, once cultured meat comes, all bets are off because I'll have no ethical problem eating beef, but also no ethical problem eating giraffe or rhinoceros, or even I don't know if I might have an aesthetic problem doing this, but maybe cannibalism could be ethical. Like you're not harming if you're not harming the person and they are alive and fine. So what if, get some celebrity meats going, like, J Lo's hamburgers, and it would appeal to a certain maybe that's a bad idea, probably a terrible idea,
I
but
think
anyway,
I think now we're seeing the benefits of lateral thinking and working
exactly.
your creativity muscle, you know. Um,
Or drawbacks, not sure if it's benefit or drawback.
two sides of the same coin. So tell me about some of the surprising things you discovered. I'll mention one here just to get the ball rolling. Is it true that it cost if you were caught swearing or blaspheming in New York, you had to pay a fine of 30, was it 37.5 cents? Is that right?
37.5 cents exactly, which was
Hmm.
about $20 now. And yes, there were very strict laws because back then the First Amendment was not the same as the First Amendment now. It was much more constrained. They were much more concerned about how free speech would affect the social order, the social good, which is sort of that balance between rights and responsibilities that we talked about. And I am super grateful. We do not live in the 1780s version of the First Amendment because we have expanded it so much, which I love as a writer. I love that. But also, it's good to remember there are costs to free speech, and maybe, misinformation and disinformation being one of the huge ones. How can we keep free speech while still controlling misinformation and disinformation? Another big surprise was that the Constitution, when you're a kid and taught about it in school, at least in America, it sort of seems like it's handed down from these demigods, but it has mistakes. It has even down to misspellings. The word Pennsylvania is spelled two different ways, P-E-N and P-E-N-N. Or there's an it's that should have an apostrophe and it doesn't, which is like you get trolled on social media for that. So it is very good to remember that it's an amazing document that has, I think, helped create democracy and made progress, and a tremendous amount of progress possible. But it's imperfect, and they knew it was imperfect. They were well aware. They wanted it to be amended. That's why they built in an amendment feature. Problem is now it's so hard to amend the Constitution because we are frozen in these two very rigid parties, and you need 2/3 of the Senate, Congress to pass an amendment. And there hasn't been one since 1992, and I don't see another one coming for a long time. And that's a problem.
What are there any things, because I know you've adopted practices from previous books. Like I think you started wearing a lot more white after your year of living biblically, like things like that, and the gratitude and everything else as well. What practices from this book have you adopted that are going to stick with you, do you think?
Well, one you mentioned earlier is the writing by hand. I love that. Um, I would say one I have is Ben Franklin. First of all, he famously said, early to bed, early to rise makes man healthy, early to rise." I do now go by the Ben Franklin schedule. I don't get up at 5 like he does, but maybe 5:30, 5:45. And I find it a much better for schedule for productivity. But in addition, when he woke up, the first thing he did was he asked himself, what good shall I do today? What good? How can I make the world better? And then at the end of the day, he would say, how did I do? Did I make the world any better? And I love that. I wrote it out and put it on above my desk as a sort of moral North Star to think, this is kind of what I want to be thinking about and devoting my life to. So, and it is helpful. Like if I get angry that I put something on Instagram and it doesn't get enough likes, and I'm getting all irritated. I look and I'm like, all right, what good shall I do today? Is this really what I should be spending my mental energy on? Or should I be looking at, sort of what is my bigger purpose? And so I find that incredibly inspiring from Ben Franklin.
He's an extraordinary person when you think about it. And one of the things he did, by the way, anybody who hasn't read it, Walter Isaacson's biography of him is
Mm,
outstanding. But one of the things he did was he mapped out all the virtues,
mm,
and then he had like a notebook, and he would pick, I think it was one virtue per week, or he might focus on a specific virtue on a specific day of the week, and then if he ever broke the virtue, he would make like a black mark in it. So every
right.
day he's like trying to like live in alignment with these things that have sort of are likely to lead to a good human life, you know. And it's interesting that he did it and he things worked out so well for him. I'm not saying that's what caused things to go uh so well for him, but it probably contributed at least to some degree.
Oh, I love that too. Yeah, he was sort of a very self-help thinker, one of the first, and really tried to systematize it. I mean, like everyone, he had his flaws. He was a terrible husband, pretty bad father. Also, the 13 virtues, I agree with most of them, but one of them is chastity, which he was terrible at, especially as a young man. But I also don't think that, I try to be sex positive. Is chastity really a virtue? Not necessarily. But yes, overall, the big takeaway is he was very systematic and approached his life like a scientist. Like, how can I improve myself? How can I improve my country? And I totally admire him for that.
Do you believe that one person, an individual, can make an effective contribution in society or can make a major change in society?
Well, it's interesting because I believe most progress is a uh, takes thousands of people, millions of people, and that was one of the points of my book on coffee is that it takes thousands of people to do anything, even make a cup of coffee. At the same time, paradoxically, one person can make a huge difference. And I'll just give you one story I discovered while researching this book, which was that this was 1918, 1919 or so. And this was the 19th Amendment, which is the one that gives women the right to vote. Now, in the American system, you need three-quarters of the state legislatures to approve of that. So they had in 1919 all but one state that they needed. They had enough. They just needed Tennessee, I think it's Tennessee, yeah, to sign off on it. So they needed the majority of the Tennessee Senate to say, yes, we approve of the 19th. But it was very close. It came down to a couple of swing votes, a couple of human beings who could decide whether these millions of women had this right to vote. And one of them was this guy whose mother wrote a note and put it in his suit pocket. And the note said, among other things, be a good boy and vote for this amendment. And he looked at the note and he was leaning against it, but he said, my mom told me to, so I am going to vote for it. And he voted. And that is one of the reasons why women have the vote is that this woman, this mom, wrote a note to her son saying, Phoebe Burr was her name. Phoebe, I'm pretty sure that's her name. Phoebe, wait, Phoebe is her first name. I can't remember her last name, but if you look it up, it's a wonderful story. And so there's an example. Yes, sometimes one human can make a huge difference.
It's just when you think about
Burns,
the
Phoebe Burns, pretty sure that's it.
baby burns, when you think about, the consequences there, like this one woman had this thought, this intention, I'll write this note and I'll put it in my son's jacket today, and that's it. And then he goes to thing, votes votes in favor of women getting the vote, and then because of that, millions of lives are changed worldwide. And it's just this one woman intention. Obviously, there's a whole tidal wave going on around this, but these wee things matter. you know.
Yeah, it's super inspiring. And Buckminster Fuller, the great thinker, he had a metaphor about the trim tab, which is a little part of the rudder on ships. And if you have a big enough ship and it's going far enough, like one little adjustment on the trim tab can mean hundreds of miles of difference. So that was his metaphor of how one human can make a big difference.
Very cool. All right, just one last question, AJ, before we go. You've spent all this time thinking about the American Constitution. Have you considered whether each of us should have our own personal constitution? And if so, what would go on the AJ Jacobs personal constitution?
Well, it's interesting because when I was interviewing one of the experts on other countries' constitutions, his side project was family and roommate constitutions. And so I actually experimented that with my family, and I am in favor of it. We had so there are two parts to your average constitution, sort of the mission statement. So we drafted a mission statement, which was that we shall pursue our own happiness, but at the same time try to pursue the happiness of our greater family, our town, our country, and the world at large. So that's our mission statement. And then we spelled out both rights and responsibilities. Rights like, my teenage sons have the right to sleep late without us giving them crap. But responsibilities like, responsibility to pay attention to the other people's passion projects, even if we don't really care about the topic. It's just a nice family thing to do. So, yeah, I think it's an excellent exercise. I don't think it should be mandatory, but I do recommend people experiment with family or roommate constitutions.
Right. Well, AJ, it's been so much fun speaking with you today. I've enjoyed every minute. Where can people get the book? Where can they find you online and connect with you?
Yes, well, I loved our chat. So thank you again. And people, my website is ajjacobs.com. I have a Substack, a weekly newsletter, free, that's called Experimental Living with AJ Jacobs. Experimental Living with AJ Jacobs. I also do a podcast called The Puzzler, where I give fun, short audio puzzles to our celebrity guests.
Thank you, AJ.
Thank you. It was a delight.